Hello class and welcome to Immunology. Today we're going to discuss Unit 1, which is our first line of defense, and it's basically all those natural barriers that help protect us from getting an infectious disease. So stay tuned while we go through Unit 1. We're going to go ahead and start by going over a few terms, and the first term I want to discuss is the term immunology, which is basically the study of systems responsible for the disposal of foreign material, and that's material that the body considers to be non-self. It's actually the interaction of body components to fight disease or infection, and like I said, in the study of immunity, we are defending our body from things that the body considers to be non-self. Serology is basically the laboratory testing. Typically, this is testing on patient's serum, and we are looking for antibody. But it's basically the study of diagnostic procedures connected with resistance and immunity. Antigen and antibody reactions are noted in vitro. So again, serology is the diagnostic procedures where we are looking for antibody reactions noted in a test tube or on slides. And then immunobiology is a specific study of hypersensitivity and autoimmunity. It is a branch of biology dealing with immunological effects or infectious diseases. There are several body factors or systems, you could say, involved in resistance to disease. These are the components of the natural barriers that protect us from getting sick. And there are several natural barriers, and these are considered to be the first line of defense. One of our natural barriers is in the intact skin. Then we have components of the mouth and respiratory tract. We have components of the gastrointestinal tract. We have components of the genital tract and components of the urinary tract. And these are all things that are natural barriers that protect us from getting an infectious disease. So let's go ahead and discuss intact skin and how it is a natural barrier protecting us from infectious diseases. There are several components of the skin that do protect us from getting an infectious disease. One such component is, of course, sweat. Sweat, of course, is slightly acidic, and this inhibits bacteria, and that's because there's lactic acid present in sweat. Lysozyme is an enzyme secreted by macrophages that destroys the cell walls of gram-positive bacteria that are found on the skin. Fatty acids are found in omega-3s, and you can find omega-3s in flax oil and things like that, but most people are deficient in fatty acids. Fatty acids on the skin are toxic to bacteria and fungi, but like I said, most people are deficient in fatty acids. Okay. Sloughing off of the epithelial cells is another way that we can prevent infectious diseases from occurring on the skin. Organisms that are stuck onto the skin will then be discarded with the sloughing off of epithelial cells. Sebum is the oil on the skin, and this comes from the sebaceous gland. It has antimicrobial properties. So sweat, lysozyme, fatty acids, sloughing off of the epithelial cells, and sebum, these all contribute to the body's first line of defense. There are components of the mouth that are considered natural barriers when it comes to protecting us from getting an infectious disease. And such barriers include things like mucous membranes. People need vitamin A in their diets so our membranes don't actually dry out. But if you are sufficient in getting enough vitamin A in your diet, those mucous membranes protect us from getting any infectious diseases. Okay? It is probably one of our most important anatomical structures. And if our skin is damaged or the mucous membranes are damaged, that leaves us susceptible to infection. Saliva is another component of the mouth that contains things like lysozyme and secretory IgA antibody. These components actually enhance phagocytosis, activates complement, and neutralizes organisms. So saliva has antimicrobial properties as well. The acidic pH of the mouth is another reason why we do not get more infectious diseases of the mouth. Then there are shedding of the epithelial cells. So when you have bacteria trapped in the epithelial cells, those cells are either swallowed or coughed out. And then we have normal flora. There is normal flora in the upper respiratory tract, including things like alpha hemolytic streptococcus, Rothia species, coag-negative staphylococcus. These are all organisms that compete with pathogens so we don't get an infectious disease. The mouth is actually part of the upper respiratory tract, but there are components of the respiratory tract that are part of our first line of defense. One such component is the movement of mucus. So mucus in the mouth contains lysozyme, but it's also the movement of mucus that is driven by ciliated cells in the lower respiratory tract that move bacteria towards body orifices. Then we have sneezing and coughing. Sneezing and coughing removes particles that are trapped in mucus. We have nasal hairs that filter out the air we breathe, and then closing of the epiglottis when swallowing, and that protects stomach organisms from getting into the respiratory tract and respiratory tract organisms from getting into the gastrointestinal tract. We have lysozyme, and again, lysozyme is that chemical that lyses the cell walls of gram-positive organisms. And then in the mouth, we have normal upper respiratory flora. There is no normal flora in the lower respiratory tract, but in the mouth, which is our upper respiratory tract, we have a number of organisms that compete with pathogens for nutrients. Components of the gastrointestinal tract are all part of our first line of defense. There is the acidity of the stomach, which protects us from infectious diseases. The stomach has a pH of about 1, which is highly acidic, and there are only a few organisms that can actually survive this pH. Shigella species and E. coli 0157H7 can actually survive the acidity of the stomach, but most other organisms cannot. We have enzymes of the gastrointestinal tract, digestive enzymes such as peptidase that protects us from getting colonized with an infectious organism. We have normal intestinal flora, and that normal intestinal flora helps to prevent colonization of enterics and anaerobes. And then we have the constant motility of the small intestine. That's called peristalsis, and it is the constant motility of the small intestine pushing out organisms in your stool. A component of the vagina that is part of our first line of defense is the acidic pH of the vagina. The pH of the vagina is around 5.0 due to the presence of lactic acid. This is maintained by hormones, of course, and also the organism known as lactobacillus. When the pH increases, yeast infections and trichomoniasis begin to appear. Urine itself should be sterile, but in the urinary tract there are other components that protect us from getting an infectious disease. For one such example is the acidic pH of urine. Most of the time a normal urine pH is around 5.0 to 6.5, and when you start to get into that alkaline range, that's when urinary tract infections start to occur. And then, of course, we have the mechanical washing effect of urine. The mechanical washing effect of urine actually prevents skin organisms from entering the urethra of the urinary tract. There are a number of other natural barriers that protect us from getting infectious diseases. They're not necessarily body systems, but they are components of our body that prevent us from getting infectious diseases. One such example would be tears. Tears themselves contain lysozyme and secretory IgA, which protect us from infectious diseases. We have body temperature. Not all organisms will grow at 35 to 37 degrees Celsius, which is body temperature. We have oxygen tension. Anaerobes may be inhibited in areas like superficial wounds, but may be normal in the gastrointestinal tract. Age. Infants have an immunity that is not yet fully developed, and the elderly immune system is not very efficient. And so that is why people that are very young or people that are very old are more likely to develop infections. We have our cortisone levels. This is an adrenal hormone that actually decreases the inflammatory response. We have earwax, which protects our auditory canals of the ear. And then we have interferon, which is a protein released by white cells, which inhibits viral replication. And that's why it's called interferon. It actually interferes with viral replication. Then we have things like diet, metabolism, toxins, stress, hormones, nutrient levels, and serum bactericidin. So these are the ones we're going to talk about next. Diet, of course, is important in growth and development as well as immunologically. Diet, if you have a protein deficiency, your phagocytes are not very effective. Your carbohydrate levels, if you have high glucose in your diet, for example, if you're a diabetic, this actually increases your disease risk. Your lipid levels, if you have a low omega-3 or low fatty acids, it makes us more susceptible to infections. And then we have vitamin and minerals in our diet as well. If you have a decreased vitamin A, you're more prone to having skin infections, while a decrease of vitamin C makes you more prone to severe bacterial infections because our phagocytosis is impaired. So vitamins and minerals in our diet do play a role in part of our natural barriers. Then we have metabolism, and metabolism is the sum of all physical and chemical changes within an individual or person. A problem with a person's metabolism may make you more susceptible to disease. If you have the inability to degrade or synthesize intermediate metabolites of a nutrient, then your body is unable to make nutrients valuable to the body. Then we have toxins. There are certain substances that are toxic to the body, and those toxins are actually toxic to bacteria as well. So things that are toxic would be nitrates. That's something it's a type of salt that's found in our diet. Nitrites, which are broken down to dilate blood vessels and lower your blood pressure. And dyes. These are all things that are considered natural barriers. Okay. That moves us on to stress, and if you have stress and also an increase of, the production of hormones that can be affected by stress. So in other words, if you have a lack of sleep and increased stress-related hormones, that is going to decrease your T cell count and decrease your natural killer cells. So hormone imbalances can actually contribute to a person's resistance to disease. And then nutrient levels in your diet, we talked about those already. And then serum bacteriosin. Serum bacteriosin is a chemical produced by some organisms that are actually toxic to other organisms. So this is kind of a lengthy slide, but what it does is it discusses all those natural barriers that we have that can protect us from getting a disease that aren't necessarily body systems. Now, some microorganisms are especially virulent, and they have virulence factors that causes them to make us sick. And one such way that microorganisms can evade our natural barriers is by their ability to adhere to us. And they can do that through pili, which are adhesions on bacteria. One type of adhesion is called pili, and a good example of an organism that has pili, or hair-like structures that allows the bacteria to stick to mucous membranes, would be Neisseria gonorrhea. Okay, so if bacteria can attach to the host, if they do that with pili or adhesions, they can more likely cause disease. And then bacteria can often proliferate. They can replicate and cause disease, and we can actually prevent proliferation by secretory antibody, which is an IgA antibody dimer. And we can expose bacteria to certain chemicals like lysozyme and lactoferrin. Lysozyme, of course, kills gram-positive organisms, and lactoferrin is a chemical released by neutrophils and macrophages during phagocytosis. It actually competes with bacteria for free iron. So, in summary, for a disease state to develop, a microorganism has to be able to evade, overcome, or inhibit the body's normal defense mechanisms that are normally operational. The first line of defense to prevent diseases are the components of the skin, components of the respiratory tract, components of the gastrointestinal tract, and components of the urogenital tract.